a good villain. We look for villains in our movies, TV shows, even in real life. We probably don't want to admit it, but there's a certain satisfaction in seeing the bad guy get their comeuppance. Some of you may be old enough, I'm not, to remember the sitcom Hogan's Heroes. I did watch a couple episodes of it in preparation for this, by the way. Not bad. Remember Colonel Klink, the bumbling German commandant of Stalag 13, who provides endless comic relief? We chuckle at his incompetence, his self-importance, and his constant attempts to outsmart the resourceful POWs, only to be outsmarted himself. Colonel Klink cares little for his prisoners, but there's an episode titled Don't Forget to Write, where Klink displays a rare moment of concern for Hogan and his men. In this episode, Klink is ordered to the Russian front, a terrifying prospect for a man more accustomed to the comforts of his office. As the reality of combat sets in, Klink begins to appreciate his relatively peaceful, if somewhat chaotic life at Stalag 13. In a rare, caring moment, Klink even expresses concern for the well-being of the prisoners under a new, potentially harsher commandant. Now, let's be honest. Klink's concern is hardly altruistic. It is laced with self-interest, a fear of losing his cushy position. But it's a significant departure from his usual bluster and cruelty. This episode, with its rare moment of care, however subtle, prompts us to consider the humanity, even in the most unlikely of characters, and to question the ease with which we often dismiss or even delight in the suffering of others. The truth is, we enjoy seeing Klink suffer. We like to see him squirm. We enjoy his psychological torture, the self-torture of his own incompetence, the constant torture inflicted upon him by the ingenious POWs. That's part of the show's charm. But the show also tests the limits of our compassion for the villain who deserves to be brought to justice. When does justice seeking turn into retribution? When does our desire to see wrongdoers punished cross the line into perverse satisfaction in their suffering? The story of Jesus healing the centurion slave confronts our tendency to take comfort in the suffering of the enemy. In this story, Jesus heals the centurion's servant. Now, on the surface, this seems like a straightforward act of compassion. But look closer. The centurion is a villain. He is a Roman officer, an agent of the very empire that occupied and oppressed the Jewish people. He also has a slave. I say that again, a slave. When his slave falls ill, the centurion asks Jesus to heal him. Which way are the scales of good and bad tipping? The centurion shows compassion by seeking the best help for his slave. But is it genuine concern? Or is it mixed with self-interest? As Luke describes it, the slave was highly valued by the centurion. Sounds like how collectors talk about their possessions. Not only is the centurion a villain, but he's a bossy one. The centurion doesn't bother to come to Jesus himself. Instead, he sends Jewish elders to do his bidding. Again, which way are the scales of good and bad tipping? Sending elders to appeal to Jesus very well may be a show of respect. Or maybe it's a power move to display his influence on the community. Something similar happens as Jesus approaches the centurion's house. Rather than meet Jesus himself, the centurion sends yet more messengers. The centurion seems well rehearsed with ordering people around to do his bidding. How do we, the reader, feel about his status as a Roman centurion, which entitles him to special treatment? These details are enough to paint the centurion as a villain in our minds. And that villain status tempts us to hope that Jesus rejects the centurion's request. We might be tempted to think he's a Roman. He doesn't deserve Jesus' help. We're tempted to lose sight of the slave needing healing. But Jesus, remarkably, is not distracted or deterred. He chooses to heal the slave, and surprisingly, Jesus is impressed by the centurion's unwavering faith and even uses this encounter as an example for his disciples. Maybe this story, and how Luke tells it, serves as a test. We are tested to see if our desire to take pleasure in the suffering of a villain distracts us from desiring good news for the slave. In my opinion, the story reveals a fundamental truth about ourselves. We are all, to some degree, tempted to be zero-sum thinkers. Now, what is a zero-sum mindset? It's the belief that my gain must come at the expense of someone else's loss. That my success hinges on the failure of others. That the best way to lift myself up is to knock someone else down. In a zero-sum world, the economy doesn't grow. It just shifts. My fortune doesn't increase. It simply means someone else suffers misfortune. This creates a deeply cynical worldview. But in movies and novels, zero-sum games are also more entertaining. Think about it. A simple, clear-cut conflict between good and evil makes for a more compelling story. A clear hero, a clear villain. It's easier to invest emotionally, to cheer for the hero and root against the villain. Winning and losing are clearly defined. The dramatic arc is straightforward, setbacks are expected, but ultimately, we trust that good will prevail. If you've watched the Korean TV show Squid Game on Netflix, which I actually have at this point, you've watched Zero-Sum Game as an entertainment. For those unfamiliar with the fictional show, I do point out that it's fictional. Desperate contestants, driven by poverty and despair, are lured into a series of deadly children's games, all for a chance to win a massive cash prize, roughly equal to 40 million Canadian dollars. The ultimate goal is for one player to win the massive cash prize. To win the most money, all the other players must lose their lives. Thus, the winner's gain, the prize money, is precisely balanced by the collective losses of all the other participants, their lives. In a zero-sum game, one player's gain directly corresponds to another player's loss. The total sum of all gains and losses among all players will always equal 0. Squid Game uses this zero-sum game structure as a chilling metaphor for societal issues like economic inequality, the ruthless pursuit of wealth, and the dehumanizing effects of extreme competition. I think Luke tells this centurion story in a way that tests our openness to seeing Jesus' good news manifested in the world. The story of the centurion illustrates Jesus' power, not just to heal, but to transcend the limitations of our zero-sum thinking. The centurion, a man accustomed to authority and power, recognizes a higher authority in Jesus. This is the flip side of Luke's storytelling strategy. Jesus is compared to a centurion. Just like the centurion has authority over his soldiers and community, Jesus has authority over life and death. Just like the centurion won't hesitate to exercise that authority, Jesus does not hesitate to exercise his authority of life and death. And one final point. The centurion is a Gentile who has faith in Jesus. Not long ago, Jesus was rejected by his hometown. The story teaches us that God's salvation extends to Jew and Gentile. God's salvation extends to you and me. Like the centurion, can we have faith in this? Amen.